So David had to be irradiated, which meant that his whole immune system had to be knocked out, and they had to introduce a new immune system, which was his sister. So David was immunocompromised. I mean, he had no immune system at that point. And so afterwards, you have to go into strict isolation because your body cannot fight anything until the new stem cells take harvest in your body and they multiply and grow. And so David was in strict isolation in Sloan. And the first week he's fine, not feeling well, but he's okay. But the second week I saw a profound change in his personality. I mean, David was a very easygoing, happy-go-lucky child, always with a joke. And all of a sudden I saw massive change in his behavior. He was confrontational, belligerent. He was confrontational not only with us, but also the healthcare providers. And this was not David. And I kept asking all the nurses and the doctors, I said, what is going on here? And they all said the same thing. They said, we have seen this before with transplant, not only cancer transplant, but lung transplant, heart, kidney transplant. We see this with transplant children who undergo transplant, and that was all they could say. They never took it a step further. So I saw that there was really a problem here with David. He wasn't going through pain, physical pain. He was going through spiritual distress where he was questioning what was going on. And I had a feeling from my early years in nursing and really being a profound fan of Dr. Elizabeth Kubler Ross, who was the doctor who came up with the stages of grief. I really had a sense that David had questions about his mortality, but he did not bring this up to me. And from her writings, she wrote that normally teenagers will not talk about this with their parents because they don't want to pain their parents anymore. So I didn't bring this up, but I had a feeling that this was the problem. So I asked a child psychiatrist to go in, and there was only one child psychiatrist in the institution. And he just wanted to talk about David's relationship with me. And David, after the first go round with him, and the doctor came back to have another round with him, David said, "No, I don't want to talk to you. This is not the issue. I don't have a problem with my mom. I have a problem with what I'm going through." And so he fired the doctor. So finally what happened was I asked David's favorite doctor who came in to visit him. And I said, David has questions about his own mortality. I'm asking you to go in to talk to him. And the doctor had this look like a deer in front of headlights. And it was very obvious he was not comfortable with this. And I said, if you don't have the conversation, no one discussed this with him. I said, you have to go in. And I didn't give him a choice. He went into the room. 3 hours later, he came out of the room. Didn't tell me what was discussed, but he said, your son had a lot of questions. He had a lot of philosophical questions. And he walked away. He was exhausted. I mean, you could see the sweat pouring down his face. So my husband and I looked at each other and we thought, how are we going to have follow up on this discussion? And we walked into the room, and lo and behold, David was smiling. Couldn't believe it. Could not believe it. He was just like this burden had been lifted from his shoulders, and he was ready to go forward. And he was back to his old self. So I have to tell you, that was incredible to me. But It wasn't until 20 years later when we had Dr. Christina Pukalski from George Washington University, who does palliative care at George Washington University and also responsible for spiritual cares, educating healthcare providers on spiritual distress. She came to Fairfield University School of Nursing to talk to healthcare providers about spiritual distress. And they're asking her the symptoms. What are the symptoms that adults display? She said, anger, belligerence, they'll be confrontational, they're going to have sleeping problems, they're going to be very depressed. And at the end of the presentation, I stood up and I said, I just want you to know what you just described, my 15-year-old son went through. That's exactly what he went through. And I said, but no one had an answer for us. And you're giving me the answer now, that David was undergoing spiritual distress. And that's one thing that Kubler Ross talks about in her book, Children Who Are Dying. And it was very, very powerful how children are innately very spiritual. And I think as adults, we teach them to suppress it. I think if had this discussion started much earlier, and that's the true art of palliative care, that you can be getting curative treatment.
Yeah.
And you're just supporting the whole family through this trajectory.
Yeah.
You don't know what's going to happen, but if you know you're going to be supported.
Yeah.
So if something negative happens, something terrible happens, where you get that bad news, you're going to have a team in place that's going to support you. And that's the beauty of palliative care, that it can be started so early. So none of this is like at the last moment. That's the one thing I really resent, when people bring this up to you when it's so late in the illness. This should have been brought up much earlier. I know the 5 wishes, the document, the 5 wishes, that to me is such a gift, because you're planting the seed for the conversation.
Yeah.
And this is a conversation that has to be made in a very relaxed atmosphere, where you're not thinking about, okay, what are you going to do in case of an emergency? But it just opens the door, and that's what you need to have done. And look at how happy he was after he unburdened all that.
Yeah.
It just changed him.